Today, I'm going to be showing you how we enrich and validate leads automatically with Make.com, all without code. Plus, I'm going to be giving you the exact same Make.com scenarios that we use. In other words, by the end of this video, you're going to have a complete understanding and we'll be able to download these scripts just yourself so you can copy and paste it into your own process. We've enriched and validated hundreds of thousands of email addresses for our cold email campaigns, and we've done it all with automated scripts, which means once we set it up, there was no extra manual work. Hey, business owners, for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Garrick Tate, and I get B2B businesses and firms new clients with AI development and cold email outreach. Let's get started. Now, you don't need to watch any of my previous videos to get value from this one. But for context, in my last video, I walked you through how we designed our enrichment process. I created a flowchart and explained to you how it handles different edge cases. You can check out that video if you want to learn more, links in the description below, but here's a short version. So most people have the idea of waterfall enrichment, where you get an email. If you get it from one vendor, great. But if it fails, you go to another vendor, and then you try to validate it afterwards. We do something similar, but we call it Spiderweb enrichment because that's a lot more accurate underneath the hood. Here it is in all its glory and all its horror. Now, honestly, at first blush, it looks a little bit complicated, but it's actually really simple when you break it down. So what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be gifting you the Make.com scenarios that we use to do every step of this process. That way you can download them yourselves and then use them yourselves just by plug and play. So first we have whatever lead source we have. We have the prospect data. Hopefully we have email addresses. You know, this prospect data is something you can scrape from any live database. You could scrape it directly from LinkedIn Sales Navigator. You could scrape it from Apollo. You could scrape it from Zoom Info. It doesn't matter. The idea is that you have the leads, including things like their website, preferably their email address, whatever data you have, you send it through this funnel. So first, assuming we already have an email address, we first try to validate it with a cheap verifier. For us, the cheap verifier we use is Million Verifier. And depending on what it gives us, if it says it's valid, it's a catch-all email, or an invalid email, we go down these different paths. Now, there's also a chance that we don't have an email address. So either the email address we get is unvalidated, it will be a bounce email, or there's no email to speak of. So if that's the case, the service that we use is Better Contact Rocks. That's one we like to use for all our enrichment needs. It works well for us. And at that point, either they fail to get the email, at which point our process stops, or they succeed in getting the email. If they get the email, they will say it's catch-all, deliverable, which just means valid, one of these two. So let's go down this path. If the email that Better Contact Rocks gets us is valid, or our first verifier said that the original email was valid, either case, we do verify it again. The reason why we verify it a second time is we just like to validate all of our emails at least twice. So we want to double validate it. It dramatically reduces our bounce rate. That second validator itself can, of course, say something is invalid, at which point we have to start over, go back to Better Contact Rocks, or it will say it will still be catch-all, or it will say it's valid. If it's valid, we just send it to Clay. Once it goes into Clay, that's when we do our data enrichment process, no longer our contacts enrichment process, but data enrichment. That's where we add in customizations. We use AI to customize the copy. We have a lot of different frameworks for how we use Clay, and we're going to be releasing more videos about that in the future. But for now, let's walk through the rest of this process. So the only other step that I spoke of is if an email is catch-all, then we send it to Scrubby. And then Scrubby will either say it's invalid or valid, and we're off to the races. Now, before I can explain to you how our Make.com scenarios work, I first have to show you our master switchboard. Our master switchboard is a Google Sheet we use to collect all this different data, store all the data, and manage which steps of the process are going to be executed before we send everything to Clay. Once it's sent to Clay, our master switchboard is no longer involved in the process. That's really the handoff spot. But before then, our master switchboard is really the switchboard that makes everything else work. I talked about this a little bit in my last video, but I'm going to go a quick refresher here. Here is our switchboard. Now, this is just some test data. It's just my own name over and over and over again. But let's pretend each one of these is a separate row. So all the data from about A to M is just the data that we would typically get on a client early in the process. Their industry, their location, full name, company Facebook, company Twitter, so on and so forth, and a few blank columns. If I was going to add another column here, I might like to include like employee count or something else. You could add your own columns, whatever you want to track early on in your enrichment process. But for us, this works out just fine. Over to the right, we have a few separate helper columns that just do various things. You can just generally ignore those. Really, the magic starts to happen once we hit this step here. So what's going on here is that we have a series of chunks that are alternating white and gray. So this very first chunk is everything to do with the first step of our process, which is the cheap verifier here. The next batch of columns here is all the columns that have to do with our secondary step, which is our more expensive verifier. For us, that's 0 bounce. The second verifier being here. The third batch is all the columns that have to do with our third step, which is our email enrichment process, better contact rocks. And our fourth is everything to do with our catch-all verifier, which is scrubbing, which you can find is here and here. And if you were curious, that's why we numbered them 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, obviously, you can take multiple paths through this. Not every single lead is going to go through these 4 steps in this order. In fact, sometimes different leads will just skip different steps, but you can follow the process now. Let's give an example of what you would expect to work here. And then I'm going to walk you through the make.com scenarios that actually drive this behavior. So here I've erased all the data, so it's just starting from scratch. So the very first make.com scenario is going to look here at column AK and is going to say, does AK equal true? Now, AK is what's called a trigger column. This is a column where, depending if this row is matching various criteria, it will trigger yes, or it will just be blank. If it triggers yes, then what the make.com scenario will do is it will try to verify this email account using million verifier, which I'm going to show you that in a moment. I'm going to show you how you can download that below. So let me clear all the example data here and just show you what the process would look like from the spreadsheet's perspective. Once this is done, I'll then walk you through the make.com scenario so you can see how the magic is done there. And then you'll be able to download them and use them for your own purposes, as well as download this database yourself and get started. So going back to our first block, this is the block that handles the behavior with million verifier and our first cheap verifier. There are 3 columns. The first column gives the email that we're going to give to million verifier in order to validate it. In this case, it just grabs it from column M over here in case it exists. Column M being where our source dumped the email account. So if we get it from Zoom info or anything else. So once we get that, the next column is our trigger column. Our trigger column is a column that has a series of if statements within it that if all of them are satisfied, it then equals true. So our make.com, when it is triggering off of this, is just searching this column AK, to see if anything equals true. If it does, then it proceeds. If it's not, then it doesn't. What the make.com scenario will do is it will then read this true, and it will then fill this data in, either valid or invalid, based on the response we get from million verifier. And once again, I'm going to show you that part of the process in a moment. But first, I just want to show you what this looks like from the switchboard or the spreadsheet's perspective. So if it's marked as valid, we'll then put it into the second verifier. The second verifier will say, okay, we're checking Garrick at example.com. And let's say it was valid. Let's say it's Google. Once this data is filled in, this lead has been validated twice. And so what we would expect is it just skips the other 2 columns altogether. And it just then goes into the Clay section, ready to be sent into Clay. Let's say that this lead was marked as valid, but then here, when the second time it goes, let's say it was marked as invalid. So I can actually map this onto our flowchart. So let's take these 3 columns one step at a time. So this very first row said valid, valid, ready for Clay. That's shown off here as going valid, valid, ready for Clay. The second column is going invalid, ready for better contact rocks, which looks here like going from the first verifier to invalid, ready for better contact rocks. The third row went valid, then invalid, then ready for better contact rocks. So what that looks like is it went from the first validator, valid, second validator, invalid, and that's why it shoots here. So from there, I think gives you enough of a high-level highlight that from here, I can walk you through how the make.com scenarios actually work. And then you can play around with this more on your own time and download and start using these yourselves. So let's dive into make.com. Quick disclaimer, this video is going to assume that you are not so familiar with make.com, but it's also not meant to be an entire make.com tutorial. There are plenty of videos out there online about how to learn more about make.com, and I encourage you to watch those, but this will assume that you are a beginner to intermediate, and so I'll try to explain things in broad strokes so it's easy to follow along. All of these make.com scenarios are available on the AICO cheat sheet, which you can find the link to in the description below. So there are about 8 make.com scenarios that we use throughout this entire process. They are T1, million verifier checker. This is where we send data million verifier and have the emails validated. We have T2, zero bounce verifier. This is when we send emails to zero bounce to have them verified there. T3 BCR input. This is when we give data to BCR for those accounts or prospects or leads that we don't have their email account for. We have T3.2. This is when we receive the data back from Better Contact Rocks. We have T3.3. This is where we have a backup in case we failed to receive data from Better Contact Rocks. This is when we query them and ask them, hey, is the data available yet? Just in case something slips through the cracks. We have T4.1. This is when we send data to Scrubby. We have T4.2. This is when we retrieve data from Scrubby. And then we have T5, which is when we send the data to Clay. So there are about 8 scenarios total. Let's walk through them briefly. So the way you're going to download this yourself is that there is a JSON file in the AICO cheat sheet for each one of these. So all you have to do is open up a new blank make.com scenario and then import by clicking on this button right here. Just drag and drop that JSON file to here, and you'll be seeing the same thing as what you're seeing on my screen now. Then all you have to do to customize it is add in the data here, modifying the spreadsheet ID, the sheet ID. Actually, the sheet ID you should not have to change, but just in case it's there. And then you have to add in your own million verifier API key. So let me walk through how this works, and then you'll be able to run it yourself. So the very first module is Search Rows Advanced. Basically, this is the same as a regular Search Rows module in make.com, except it uses essentially query language. The reason why we do this is that even though in my example here, we only have 5 rows of data, we can sometimes create spreadsheets where there is 50,000, 80,000 rows of data in a single spreadsheet. At that point, things can start to slow down. And this, we found that using the advanced module speeds things up significantly and also reduces the number of crashes. We select all where S is greater than 1, column S being our row counter. So that's just saying basically don't include the very first row. And where column AK is not null. If you remember, column AK is where we had our trigger column. So it says true if it's time to run this. It gathers all that data, sends it to Million Verifier. Here, we aren't showing our API key, so you would have to add in your own API key, but we send it to Million Verifier one at a time and then retrieve back if Million Verifier says it's valid or invalid or a catch-all. Then from there, there's really 2 options. So by default, this scenario has the next step being a text aggregator and an API call. We did this basically as a favor because the beginner version of this would be, if I unlink that and drag this in and drag this over. This is a little more of the beginner friendly version because it just updates a single row at a time. So it's easier to debug. It's easier to understand what's doing one row at a time. However, that costs a lot of operations. So by default, we have the more efficient way of doing this, which is using a text aggregator where we take every response we get back from Million Verifier, we make essentially an array out of it in this text aggregator, and then we make a single API call to update all of the rows at the same time. With that being said, if you're just testing this out, I would probably recommend to unlink that step and to do your testing using this, and that should do you some good there. So that's about all I'll say there. All right, let's talk about T2 zero bounce. Honestly, it's pretty much the exact same thing. So you can see here, we have the spreadsheet ID and the sheet number. So from here, it's the same idea. We search all the rows where column S is greater than 1. In this case, though, we check column A in, which is the second trigger. So, if I remove this, you can see here, this is a part that, says to proceed or not. From there, we validate the email on zero bounce. And then once again, text aggregator, make an API call, or do it the old fashioned way by using this. Those are all your options. So that's it for the very first 2 steps, and that's what you're going to see. Now we come to the BCR step. So that's going to be the third step in our process. If I click here and show what that's going to look like. So in this case where, let's say a lead showed up as invalid, or let's say that a lead didn't even have an email account to speak of, then those would be the situations where BCR would become active. So once again, there's a BCR trigger. And what we would expect is that once the BCR is triggered, it will then put in I believe this is going to be essentially some sort of ID that we're going to get from BCR saying that they're now working on it. It's added to their queue, and this is the ID for their queue. Then once that's done, it's going to output the email account saying, hey, we got it back. We found, I don't know, let's say in this case, Garrick2@example.com. Turns out that was it all along. And it's going to say deliverable, or sometimes it's going to do that same process, but instead of saying deliverable, it's going to say catch-all. And depending on which one of those, it's then going to proceed with re-queuing up the second verifier or it's going to go down the Scrubby route. Once again, if we consult back to this flowchart, after Better Contact Rocks, if we get an email, it's going to be catch-all going to Scrubby, or it's going to be valid going to the advanced verifier. So that's what you're seeing here. So how does all that work in the make.conf? So the first step is we queue up the email that's going to be validated. So the way that Better Contact Rocks, unlike Zero Bounce and Million Verifier, we don't validate them one at a time. We send a batch of 100 leads to Better Contact Rocks to be validated. So the very first step is very similar. You'll get all the leads from BCR. We talked about this before. It works the same way. We gather all the leads. We loop through for BCR. We construct full data. So this is where we construct the API call. And I believe we do that basically 100 times to then send all the data to BCR. We also tell it the webhook that we're going to request that they retrieve the data from, or where they're going to send the data to afterwards. Basically, we're saying, here's 100 emails. We want you to validate them. Once they are validated, please return the data back to this address. That address is set up in T3.2, which we're going to get to in a second. And this webhook target, just like everything else that you have to customize, is all done for you at the very beginning of the process. So everything that you need to customize is over here on the left. But once we send the data over to BCR, then we do 2 separate steps. Honestly, you could just stop the entire scenario here and it's just going to work out just fine. But the other 2 steps that we have for our internal process, and since we do it ourselves, we want to give it to you guys as a gift, is that we also then do a API call to BCR saying, hey, how many credits do I have left? Because unfortunately, BCR does not allow you to auto top up. I really wish it did. That's why we like to use Million Verifier and Zero Bounce, is that if we're running low on credits, we can just auto purchase new ones. But in BCR's case, they don't. So we just add one more thing saying, hey, check the remaining credits. If it's below a certain number, if less credits than 1,200, that's our threshold. You can change that if you want. Then you can send yourself an email if you so choose. But if you don't need that, you can just unlink this. It'll work just fine. So what this is doing is a little bit different. You're updating the Google Sheets, all of the data in the Google Sheets, all the rows that are currently being processed, because it does take BCR a few minutes in order to find all the emails that you're looking for. So remember how I said before that there will be a time period where essentially we just have the unique identifier for the request, but we don't yet have data back from the request. So that's where T3.2 comes in. So this will be a scenario that you'll create. And when you do, you're going to be creating a webhook, which will give you a webhook URL here. And that's going to be the same webhook URL that you're going to install back here, so that when BCR is done getting the data, they know where to send it. That then data is sent once again to a text aggregator. Once again, sent to a text aggregator because that reduces the number of operations and makes a single API call. If you prefer, though, you can update it row by row, which will help you a little bit more debug things or look at data row by row. That's up to you. I would say that BCR has like a 99% uptime rate, but there is like 1 out of 100 times where they just make a mistake and they don't send the data back to the webhook. So that's why we made T3.3, where we run this, generally speaking, really just once a day, where we loop through every unanswered request ID. In other words, we take a look at all the request IDs that have not yet run, and then we ping BCR and say, hey, do you have data on those yet? Yes or no. So that's what's going on here. It's gathering all of that data, gathering all the requests, looping through every unique request, and then requesting that data from BCR, and then making an API call. So functionally speaking, truth be told, you really only need T3.2 or T3.3. You probably don't need both. But we do it because we prefer the real-time nature of the webhook plus the reliability of this. So we just set up both. But now let's move on to the last step, Scrubby. So Scrubby is frankly one of the harder APIs to work with, because when you're sending the data to them, we have not been able to get their webhooks to work for us. Maybe if you're a developer, that's something that you can look to on your side, if you can get that to work. We've investigated it. We've not been able to make it work. And because of that, we have to every single time ping them to get the data back. And unfortunately, it takes 48 hours to get the data back. Now, we still like Scrubby. We use them every single day. We spend a lot of money on them because they do have a high accuracy for validating catch-all emails. That has a ton of value, but is a harder API to work with. So let's walk through how it works. A little bit similar to BCR, the way it's going to work is this. Let's say an email was returned back that was a catch-all email, triggering Scrubby to say, hey, trigger column, proceed. That means we're going to proceed. We say this is what we're queuing up. Or actually, let's pretend today is today. So I'm recording this on June 20th. If it's today, then we just will have to wait 48 hours. Once 48 hours passes, let's pretend this was on the 5th. So more than 2 days have passed since this happens. It will then say, check it. This is when we send the second API call to Scrubby. And then that's the point where it will either say it's valid or invalid. If it says it's valid, then we will run it a second time. The reason why we run it a second time is because we also want to know if it's from Google or Outlook. And also zero bounce will tell us if an email is an abuse email, which basically means an email famous for flagging people as spam. Those are the reasons why we still, really verify it even again here, even though we know it's trying to say catch all. But then it's ready for play. If that part of the video didn't make sense, feel free to rewind, watch again. And we have another video posted a few weeks ago that also walks through this. So that can help explain this more detail. But now let's walk through that on a make.com level. So this is T4.1. This is when we send the data to Scrubby. Once again, you can set all the variables that you need over here on the side. The very first step is going to find everything where column AW says to proceed, AW being the trigger column. We're going to aggregate it all into a batch, put it into a JSON file, add it all to Scrubby, and then update all of the rows in the spreadsheet so that they are all marked as the date that we sent them to Scrubby and therefore the date that they are processing. Once that is done, we are sent to T4.2. This is where we search rows for data where column AW equals check. Because here we have the logic saying that if the date is more than 2 days ago, then equal check. So the logic of when to activate versus not activate is all found here. So before I was showing the example, if it was more than 2 days ago, it says check. That's when it triggers. That plays into this search here. We then gather all of that data, all of those email accounts that we want to follow up on. We put into a JSON file again, and we add it to Scrubby. From there, if everything works as expected, if all the statuses are 200, we'll go down this path, which fundamentally then is just about updating those rows. Unfortunately, when we send the data to Scrubby, if we send it a batch of 100 emails we want to check and it returns, it doesn't add it in the same row count. So we basically have to search row by row to then update all of them. And so this whole process is a little bit slower or takes more steps. But that's essentially what everything here is doing. Sometimes, very rarely, an account will take more than 48 hours to process. If that's the case, then we mark it as still pending, so it goes on this path. But if it's marked as valid or invalid, we go on this path, and we're happy with it. So that is what all that's about. This step here, this path going down here, is a pretty rare edge case, but it's an edge case where, for some reason, Scrubby claims that we never sent them that data. And so everything here is kind of a machine to handle that, where essentially we then just mark them as, okay, we'll send it to you again. Basically, we delete, if Scrubby's just saying, hey, we never received that email, it's not in our process, then we essentially remove those specific emails from our switchboard so that it will become reactivated once again in T4.1. All right. So all of this was built so you don't have to build it. So all of this, once again, if you're customizing this yourself, feel free to walk through it in a little bit more detail. But the magic really is just you edit the variables on the far left, you add your own API key, and all of this will just work out of the box if you're using the same switchboard. And last, we come to send to Clay. So this is the last step of the process. Once the email has been double validated and gone through the entire rigmarole, we then send that lead into Clay. So the way we do this is that first we get all the column headers. So this is really just a way to customize the column headers for your Clay table, particularly the column headers found over here. So, we like to use like camel case, profile URL, first name, full name, so on and so forth. So because these column headers here are modifiable, that's why we get all the column headers here. So that when we send all the data to Clay, they will be labeled the same as the column headers. Then we select all the leads for importing and we send it to Clay. With the column headers from module 92, being the title of the variables, and then the actual data in those rows being the actual content of those variables. Now, when we send things to Clay, I've noticed if you send 100 pieces of data into a Clay table all at the same time, that Clay table will crash. So we send it row by row, and we add a 2-second sleep module. And once that's done, we then make an API call for those 100 leads, claiming that they have all been added into Clay. One quick note, if you don't know how to set up Clay table so it's ready to receive that data, let me show that to you now. We'll have future videos explaining more about how we set Clay tables, but just a quick preview. So this is a Clay table. This is just our test master table. And the way we set it up so that it can receive data is we just went to actions, import, webhook, And that then sets up a source so they can now receive data from that webhook. You can find that webhook on the far left. If you left click it, sources, and then pick which one. In this case, I just added a second webhook. You only need one though, but that webhook then will be found here on the side. You can copy that, and that make.com webhook is going to be what you paste into the master spreadsheet. Actually, a note about that. If you want to run multiple campaigns from the same spreadsheet, we have them all list off in settings. So you can add your different campaigns or multiple campaigns and multiple clients here, and then paste the webhook URL into this point. So this is like says link 1, for instance, for client 1, which then depending on which client this belongs to, on the far side, it will show different links. So you can just paste that webhook URL here. If that seems complicated for any reason, feel free to also just update the send to Clay right here instead. All right, that's it for today's presentation. I know that's a lot, but this is a video that you can watch more than once. And importantly, you can also download all these assets yourself, play around with them, understand them, and then you can really just get them working out of the box for you. This video took a lot of work to create and laying out our entire process out on the table. And if you want our help to set up your campaign for you, then feel free to reach out to us. You can contact me on LinkedIn, or you can find our contact info on our website, AICoLoutreach.com. Until next time. Why would you choose Apollo instead of using LinkedIn? Apollo has a lot more filters that really help you narrow down your target market even further. Though I would warn you that if you can get away with using LinkedIn, that you probably should, because LinkedIn has more up-to-date information.